The PlayStation 1 was a golden era for a lot of genres, with amazingly detailed 32-bit RPGs and outstanding 2.5D platformers being the ones most people look back on. These were for a while some of the most impressive things you could do on this aging system, which had a lot of storage capability but had weaker specs than the 3D powerhouse of a Nintendo 64. PlayStation could do 3D, but it felt more limited and lacked the fluidity and open expanses of its quote-unquote competition. But then, Spyro the Dragon with his trilogy of console-defining masterpieces came in. These games achieved things the PlayStation honestly wasn't meant to. This console is as old as Donkey Kong Country, but here it is putting some of the Nintendo 64's best to shame. And all that extra storage meant we had CD quality music and voice acting to work with on top of everything else. The PlayStation 1 Spyro trilogy are games I can look at critically, and I do plan to eventually, but when I play them casually, they're some of my favourite things ever. And even when I do say things like Spyro 2 is terrible, I only mean that in comparison to 1 and 3. I still love Spyro 2, it's better than most games ever made. But this trilogy isn't all Spyro did. Most people do move on to discuss Enter the Dragonfly, which to many is seen as Spyro the Dragon 4, and what I saw it as when I was a kid. But it wasn't the fourth Spyro game. That title belongs to Season of Ice, a Game Boy Advance title that also shared the distinction of being the first non-Insomniac game in the series. And based on my research, it is also responsible for a lot of kids getting angry. Season of Ice is the first of the Digital Eclipse trilogy of Spyro the Dragon Game Boy Advance games, and by most accounts it is their worst one too. But that's not enough to stop me. If I want the full picture of this non-canon and forgotten 20-year-old sub-series, I need to start from the beginning. This game picks up sometime after the end of Spyro 3, which makes sense since it was the last game out at the time, but since Enter the Dragonfly basically rewrites this timeline as the real sequel to Spyro 3, it is quite easy to forget about this. The sorceress is defeated, and the two furries are in a committed relationship, and the other woman who mattered in the series isn't here because Spyro would rather be a third wheel than be with the girl who wants to be with him. Interrupting this relaxation, the trio get a letter from Zoe, a fairy from the earlier games. She says someone is using magic to freeze every fairy in blocks of ice, and the Rhinox have returned. This is very much a sequel to Spyro 3, since every enemy is just a Rhinox here unfortunately, but at least they do come in a few different flavors to spice it up. Our collectibles this game are the fairies, which I love as a MacGuffin. Spyro 1 had dragons, Spyro 3 had baby dragons, and Spyro 4 had dragonflies. I love saving these things with names, and it's even better when it recontextualizes something we already knew, like the dragonflies. It is a lot better than the generic orbs of Spyro 2. So that's the premise, save fairies across the fairy worlds and defeat the Rhinox. Pretty simple and straight to the point. However, one immediate problem does arise, and the game will only get worse with it as we progress. Originality is not a high priority here. I don't mind the main collectible just being a named MacGuffin that has been frozen in place, and I can even forgive the reuse of Rhinox as this is a direct sequel, and it does tie into the events of the previous games. The hub world is my real issue here. We have 4 of them and they're all based on seasons. On one hand, I want to congratulate them for not forgetting about one of them like Spyro 2 did, but on the other hand, this is just a poor aping of Spyro 2's identity. This game feels like an odd fusion of previous games, namely 2 and 3, and depending on how charitable you are, you can either say this game has homages or ideas directly lifted from Spyro 1, but at least very little less in your face than 2 and 3 stolen ideas. This hub introduces us to the soon-to-be copy-pasted design method. We have fairies here trapped in ice, and they will be freed with a breath of fire, not that one unfortunately. And these hubs also contain the levels themselves, which are accessed after having the right quota of fairies or gems to progress. The levels themselves come in 3 main varieties: Traditional, Speedway, and Sparx. The traditional ones are where the majority of your time should be spent, and what players think of when it comes to Spyro levels, albeit with a different camera perspective. These are completely open environments where you're free to explore, more so than the previous trilogy actually, which did have some very linear progression in some instances. In some ways it's freeing to have these completely open playgrounds, but this feeling soon dissipates. The way the game does this is by making every level basically just be chunks of land, taking up the same square grid. Everything feels the same, and if some level layouts were swapped with others I wouldn't even notice. It's really the aesthetics that allow me to tell any two levels apart, but those aesthetics are at least nice. This is a pretty game, and its soundtrack is amazing, even given the lack of proper sound hardware for the Gameboy Advance. And the fact that this is the first Spyro game to not use a Stuart Copeland soundtrack. Even Enter the Dragonfly has one of those, so this game is sandwiched between two of Copeland's. But that doesn't matter, the musical selection of this game rocks, and shows that others were up to the task of composing Spyro tracks. I'd go as far to say the music is probably the best bit of the entire game, but that's more of a criticism of the rest of the game than a veneration of the music, but it is great music. The levels themselves are not only simplistic, but they're incredibly easy to get lost in. We have no map of any kind unfortunately, at least in the American and PAL releases. In a first for the Spyro the Dragon series, the Japanese version is the best, since there is a map that can be accessed at any time, but this version does have weirder looking cutscenes, so pick your poison. The best version of this game also has the cutscenes where characters look like they are allergic to all the bee stings they must have received. Each of the level's geography here is just some tiles with some bridges, and maybe an elevated section in the corner if you're lucky. Because of the perspective, the elevated sections cannot be in the foreground, which is good, but it does add to the feeling of everything being the same. The sameness doesn't just end with level design, but the goals themselves. They generally all fit the same mold every level. We rescue frozen fairies just like the hub world, and we can activate and or collect the objects that stick out of the environment, whether they be living creatures that need saving, or lighthouses that aren't lit up. And levels generally have two of these collecting tasks, just because one wasn't enough. The second one of these is significantly harder, as they must all be found on the same life, as a death will reset the counter on those specifically. Thankfully, that does only apply to those specific items. I can easily say I was never a fan of these, but the levels do get better with some specific tasks, as we generally do get a fairy for killing every Rhinoc in a stage, which is enjoyable to accomplish, but also something I would have done just normally. It's good to be rewarded for the bare minimum. The only problem with that is collecting a fairy of any kind teleports you somewhere else in the level, and it can be quite common to see two things on the same screen that'll each reward you a fairy, but instead of getting them seconds apart, you'll get one, be sent to another part of the map, and then spend a few minutes trying to get unlost, find where you actually were, collect that, and then be teleported again. And given the game's depth perception issues, you could still die en route as well, which only makes things more complicated. My only solace is we aren't booted out of a level Mario 64 style. At least everything stays collected and we aren't back to square one. It's the little things. This will be a majority of the game, but some levels do change things up slightly. Perhaps instead of collecting the actual objects, you'll have to hit them in a certain order, or lead bees to honey, or kill certain aerial enemies with the help of these geysers. It's not much, but these were memorable moments to me, and it showed me everything wasn't just a copy and paste, despite how much it felt like it a lot of the time. Plus we still have the thieves here to catch, and these were always one of my favourite parts of the original games. Even if it is worse here given the perspective and how zoomed in everything is, it was still a highlight for me because at the end of the day, this is about rewarding mastery of the controls and how to navigate the immediate obstacles put in front of us. And the controls here are a joy and I loved becoming familiar with them. This is a pretty simple transition from the PlayStation games to a console with barely any buttons, and it works better than it has any right to, honestly. We still breathe fire, charge, jump, and do that little hover thing at the end of our glide. That is really all we need. It was simplified a little bit with the hover being incorporated into the jump button itself, and charging is done with the right shoulder button, which is different, but given the amount of buttons available, this was the best option they could have done, and it works very well here. It was incredibly comfortable. The only odd things here are the three weird buttons. The L can be used to change camera when at a standstill, barely used but it does help on occasion since the game is so zoomed in. Start is also doing what it should be doing, a simple but needed roll. In addition to pausing the game, it lets us see the statistics, options, and all that other fancy stuff. And then we have Select, and this is just a shortcut to a page that was already easily accessible from the pause menu. This is at most a slight convenience, but something else could have been mapped here, and in the Japanese version this is how the map is accessed. So the English versions of the game really do have Select feeling like an afterthought that you don't even need to use. Other than that, there is nothing to fault with the controls here. I originally didn't like the game being at the diagonal angle, which has never been my favourite in these types of games, but I got used to this pretty quickly and it did not become any kind of issue to me after extended play. From a control and perspective mechanic, this is a great translation of Spyro without losing its appeal. They could have easily made this top-down or from a side-on perspective, but here we get a comfortable middle ground between those two, and it feels 3D without doing that weird kind of GBA 3D which has its own perspective issues. Speaking of which, Speedway stages. These were some of my favourite stages in the first 3 games. Each title had its own take on it and they didn't all use the name Speedway, but these were basically high score challenges where we have free flight, and it was a nice change of pace for those of us that wanted more challenge and tight gameplay. And when I was a kid, it was always the part I dreaded since it was so hard. Spyro Season of Ice is definitely nostalgic despite me not playing it before, because for the first time in like 17 years, I dread doing these Speedway stages and I never want to do it again. These aren't like previous Speedways, they're still behind the character and free flying, but instead of an obstacle course we have to navigate, we have hoops and we shoot enemies with bad depth perception. The best way to describe it is like a terrible version of Space Harrier, or for a reference today's youth will understand because you will eventually be my only demographic, it's like a terrible version of the iOS and Android version of Space Harrier 2 Classic. The main issue here at first is the depth perception being bad, but once you get your head around that, the strict time limit becomes your end. The clock is ticking down, but seconds are made up for by shooting enemies and going through hoops, which is similar to previous titles, but this game eventually starts expecting near perfection by the end, and on the final variations of these, I had to contemplate if it was even worth beating this game. This just isn't fun. I got through them, but I regret it and I want those minutes of my life back. Here is your pro tip to enjoying this game. Play it until you feel satisfied with what you've accomplished, and stop. It's not worth doing the final boss or seeing the credits, because they are locked behind you getting every single fairy in this game, and that is simply not worth it. The Speedway stages are not fun. They might seem fun at first. There is kind of a joy in the first few, but by the end of these there is no shame in giving up. There is another type of stage here borrowed from previous titles, and this is a much more faithful transition. Sparx the Dragonfly had his own levels in Spyro 3, and they were fun for what they were. They weren't my favourites. They were a nice change of pace, and they made the most of a concept they could. And that's evidenced here because we get uninspired and repetitive Sparx levels that all feel like identical mazes without any of the charm. They really did use up all the creativity they had. All the enemies are the same. The corridors are more tight to navigate, so collisions are more common, and the only saving graces are the frequent checkpoints and the infinite lives in these sections, and only these sections, which feels like an apology from the developers themselves. These sections being quick bursts of top-down fun in Spyro 3 meant that this should have been an excellent conversion. There was nothing for them to alter, just ported over with fresh designs. But unfortunately, these were done so poorly that while these weren't the worst moments of Season of Ice by any means, the Speedway still have that nailed down. These are the most disappointing part, since it should have been a slam dunk, but it missed the mark. Wow, this has been a lot of me complaining. Why do I like this game again? I guess it's just, the game just clicked with me. This game was actually a lot of fun once I got used to the quirks and ignored the bits I didn't like. I'll never defend the Speedway or even the Sparx sections, but the main levels are fun, albeit lacking the variety it clearly needed. Quirks of this game include focusing on Spyro's drop shadow and pretending he doesn't exist at all once he's airborne. Just look at the drop shadow only. And navigating the maps by focusing on the borders around the levels and using other context clues to determine your way around. Each of these levels have some kind of distinctive outline, around the solid ground we can walk on. That way the player can properly see the edge of a map, and these are mostly contextual. Some levels surrounded by water may have waves dotting the land, or rocks laid out in an ornamental fashion. Market Mesa uses differently coloured bricks to determine the altitude, and this is a level that is laid out so simply I never got lost or confused. Some levels, however, aren't laid out in such a way where we can easily tell where the borders are, so we need to rely on these outlines. For better and worse, Season of Ice has a wide variety of themes, and given the hardware limitation, these are conveyed in very abstract ways. Hummingbird Fort is above the treetops, but this is done with floating platforms that look like they're made out of green flannel, with tied up logs keeping it from getting loose. Frankly, this level is a mess and easily my least favourite of the traditional levels, and every level of altitude here looks basically the same, and it doesn't stand out much from the also green background we have. So you need to focus on the logs surrounding a platform. So whether it be for a beehive or some kind of electronic computer world, things will make more sense eventually once you focus on the perimeter itself, so you can properly judge the depth of everything. Just wish we had more signposting so you don't glide directly into a wall and die. The terribly named level Roman City, which is also one of my least favourite just because of how much I got lost in it and its obsession with me finding multiple locations that look exactly the same, does at least do a good job of signposting. This has water surrounding it with waves signalling the edges, and it's against a brown floor as well, sometimes with purple carpet and grass just for extra visual flair. Everything stands out so far, and then we have the higher platforms which are obviously very different as they are blue and white tiles. Generally speaking, any one section of a level looks like any other. This is terribly laid out and probably the second easiest map to get lost in. Hummingbird Fort still has that one, but it's easy to know what is ground and what is of a higher section. The levels here for some reason are built in such a way that you will die once you fall off the main platform. Like basically every level in the game except for the very early Lava Prairie has a death pit waiting underneath you. In Lava Prairie, when you go off the edge, you'll fall into lava, and Spyro will lose one segment of health once he touches it, and he'll be forced to jump up, which will give you enough time to try to make it to upper land before you keep losing more health and eventually die. It is a great safety net here, but weirdly enough, the water levels here have no such courtesy. Whenever Spyro can't swim in water in the original trilogy, he would similarly lose one segment of health and have a chance to get back to safe ground. Unfortunately, that wasn't incorporated here, which is a shame since it could have been a great way to introduce players to this game, which has a very different perspective. It would have allowed players to make a mistake and not be so punishing, especially considering we have a water level available right from the beginning of the game. And given this game's knockback, a gentler approach to early levels would have been appreciated. A single hit can send you falling to your demise. When Spyro does lose health, it is still represented here with Sparx, and since he isn't very easy to see during regular gameplay, a Sparx icon will appear whenever his health depletes, which makes it much more obvious what Spyro's total health is whenever it changes. In some ways this is more helpful than it was during the PS1 games since this is much more in your face. And that's about everything worth to discuss, so it's time to mention something that isn't worth discussing: the boss. Spyro games usually aren't great in the boss department. They're usually fine but not worth talking about, or not fine and worth criticizing. Here we get the latter, but it's even more forgettable than Spyro 1's boss levels. We have Grendor, a Rhinoc who used a spell that backfired on him and gave him a second head. Riveting, I know. Fight him once in the middle of a game, and again at the end if you choose to go that far, and that's it. His fight isn't fun, but thankfully it isn't too hard either, since the level is happy for you to brute force it with butterflies just off the side, so you can keep taking breathers during the game, just have a timeout, eat some more, go back into the battle, and it can be a battle of attrition if you just don't want to learn the timing and want to get it over and done with without even thinking. Spyro's Season of Ice is not a great game by any means, but in the context of when it came out and for the hardware it released on, and by a studio that hadn't tackled the franchise before, it's pretty nice, I guess. And by today's standards, as a game on its own merits, it's still pretty nice. but you have to ignore the last few speedways unless you really care about a terrible final boss and a bonus level not worth all that torment. This is probably a great game for those people that use save states and a bunch of slowdown to make the so-called speedways tolerable. And more power to you, but that isn't me. To me, this is just the rocky start of Spyro's other trilogy of games, and what a fun way to spend an afternoon, as long as you don't mind getting lost and depth perception issues being a large portion of the overall experience. I am a simple person. I collect shiny things, and I feel good when I do. And this is just more of that. So I'm glad I played Season of Ice. Even if I'll probably never touch it again, I'll at least remember the shiny things that made my brain feel good.